Now pass.
Thanks, Cahir. Look, I move that the bill do now pass.
Sorry, I had my hand up.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Deputy Smith.
Yeah, I am very disappointed that our amendment was rejected. But nevertheless, I just want to say a few words on this bill before it does pass. We don't intend to oppose it, but we do want to make some general points and ask a number of questions. First of all, to acknowledge that the Building Momentum deal has been accepted by a large majority of workers and trade unions that were balloted. And though we are told this is a technical bill, which will allow for some pretty small pay rises to be paid to our public servants, many of whom, of course, were at the front line in the battle against COVID and still are. One thing I want to put in the record is that this bill amends the 2009 Act to permit the state to award a small pay increase to the thousands of public servants. The Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest, the FEMPI Act of 2009, was blocking that. And since I've been in the Dáil, and since 2016, I've had to raise each June the FEMPI Act and the reason for its continued existence on the statute books. Every June, the Minister was obliged to come in and to lay a report before the House which claimed that we still have a financial emergency and therefore we still needed the emergency legislation and the powers that it gave the state. Because lest we forget, this is an extraordinary piece of legislation, an emergency piece of legislation, yet 11 years later it remains on the statute books and retains its power, such that we need to amend it to allow a small pay increase for public servants. The original bill allowed the government of the day and subsequent governments really to hammer public sector workers to actually pass laws to cut their pay, their pensions and their conditions. Subsequent amendments to FEMPI 2009, also mentioned in this bill, gave extraordinary powers to a government to select for punishment any trade union which dared not to accept a national pay deal. And this Act and its subsequent amendments were a fundamental and extraordinary attack on workers and the right to collective bargaining, and an attack on retired workers and their pension schemes. We know what the justification was and is: the financial emergency, which means the collapse of the global financial system caused by greed and deregulation and systemic corruption at the heart of the system. We know its particular impact here, and that was caused by the banks, the developers and those who the state bailed out, and many of whom are now back in business and looking forward to a bumper time ahead when the LDA lands will be handed over to them. But that's history. It was 11 years ago. But every June since 2016, I've asked and requested the Minister to come into the House and tell us why the Act is being renewed. And each year the Finance Minister came in and declared that yes, we still had a financial emergency and we still needed the FEMPI Act. Every June we declared a fictional emergency to retain the Act and its anti-worker provisions. Clearly, we didn't have an emergency for many of those years, but the Minister still declared it in order to retain the legislation. An emergency law has become a permanent law, and its use is a warning there for many of us, particularly in light of the earlier discussion around emergency legislation. But it's also clear that this and previous governments find emergency laws very useful to discipline workers and to discipline trade unions. So before you pass the bill, Minister, or propose to pass it, and I believe a pathetic reward for our frontline workers, I want to place on record that the nurses who continue to work unpaid hours as a result of FEMPI and its successors, the pensioners who continue to deal with the impact of cuts and attacks on their pensions because of FEMPI, and new workers in the public service who continue to deal with pay apartheid, with reduced pension rights and new labour practices because FEMPI has not been forgotten or forgiven what was done to them during the financial emergency. We're told that this bill effectively marks the end of the FEMPI era and takes those handcuffs off. I disagree. And to the extent that this bill continues the tradition and indeed it continues the aims of FEMPI. On the bill itself, there's little to say. I believe the increases are an insult to many public servants, those, for example, in the health sector who have fought heroically against this virus. But I note much of the commentary by ministers and others around the COVID crisis and the acceptance of new work practices from public servants. Their commentary amounts to saying, thanks, You've all bent over backwards during this emergency, and we'd like to reward you by continuing the emergency measures that change the work practices and make them permanent, regardless of the diminution that might involve in the quality of your life. I note in passing two more things in the bill: the sectoral bargaining element. This really offers at best an extra 1%. Which will not address the crisis in our health or other key public services, nor address the many outstanding issues in those sectors, be they defence forces, nurses or other grades. And while the clause that deals with the unpaid hours element dates of 2022 and a pot of 150 million to cover all the sectors affected, we know that the combined value of the increased working from the hours that these people gave for free was at 583 million in 2016 alone. Additional hours worked by public servants under both agreements in 2016 equated to 15 million unpaid hours. So this deal doesn't deal with the unpaid hour element of the crisis measures and is an insult to public sector workers. The deal offers 2% over 2 years, with a possible 1% through local bargaining, which may be used to pay outstanding adjudications and rewards. Thus, only 2% is guaranteed. Across the economy, wages increased by 6.9% over 2 years, 2018 and 2019. This deal will not allow public servants to catch up, nor does it acknowledge the heroic efforts during the COVID crisis. Despite the massive shift to home working, there's no compensation to cover the significant costs from working at home. And like all workers, public sector workers have faced rising costs. While their pay rose by 2% and 1.7% in 2018 and 2019, rents rose by 6% each year. In 2020, they have risen 2% even with the COVID restrictions. And this deal means the introduction of new ways of working across the board, new systems in the workplace. I quote, maximum use of innovative and flexible models of service delivery, embracing the use of technology and allowing for greater movement of staff. We're being asked to sign up to a sectoral action plan which has yet to be agreed. Payment of wage increases are dependent on these plans being implemented. Despite claims of union leadership, outsourcing of public sector jobs will continue under this deal. Management will still be allowed to claim exceptional circumstances as a justification for privatisation and outsourcing. So I believe this is not a very happy day for public sector workers. It's rather a sad day where they're having to accept the crumbs off the table without the acknowledgement that they absolutely deserve.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. Before I leave in members, I'll just remind them we're at fifth stage, so that we should be speaking